Hey, macro folks, this is Mr. Hooker for another video on fiscal policy. So let's look at these arguments about expansionary fiscal policy working. Number one, government spending always crowds out private spending. So, problem here is that it assumes resources are always fully employed, which they're not. So, especially not during a recession. So, if we have a recession, their unemployed resources and output and income are below the potential level. So, using expansionary fiscal policy during a recession puts those unemployed resources to work and generates higher spending. So, government spending crowds out private spending only when the economy is operating at full employment. So, if the economy is operating at full employment, there should be a somewhat minimal level or a normal level of government spending and not some massive level of government spending like what you would see during a recession, like what you saw during COVID, what you saw during 2007 to 2009. Those are not what you're looking for during a time frame. Two, government borrowing always crowds out private investment spending. Um, the thing here, whether crowding out occurs depends on whether or not the economy is depressed or not. And if it is, the fiscal expansion leads to higher incomes, which leads to increased savings. The Recovery Act of '09 was case in point. They spent a ton of money in '09, and U.S. interest rates stayed really close to zero. So, yeah, that didn't happen. Also, I've read papers on this whole crowding out effect. So, there's a phenomenon known as the crowding out effect. And the idea being the government borrowing crowds out private investment spending. So we don't want as much government borrowing. And I've read papers on this that say, look, any crowding out effect is really somewhere between like zero point 0.2 and 1%. So like it's nowhere near as big a deal as it is thought to be, as it is pretended to be in an economics class. Like it's nowhere near that large. So, quit overemphasizing it because, like, when we talk about it in an economics class, we make it seem like it's this big, big deal. And really, it's not. It's not even close. So, crowding out, not really a thing. And three, government budget deficits reduce private spending. This is known as the Ricardian equivalence after economist David Ricardo, who came up with the idea that we should trade when we did international trade. He's the guy that came up with that idea that we should trade based on comparative advantage, not absolute advantage, which was an awesome idea. Now, this idea of Ricardian equivalence, not so awesome. But it assumes that consumers, seeing the higher debt levels, will cut their spending today to save for inevitable increases in future tax rates. Now, that may have been true in the 18th century, or technically, I guess that was the 19th century because that was 1800. So, 19th century, that may have been true. In the 20th and 21st century, people just don't look that far ahead, man. Like, people are not that flippin' concerned. Um, if it ain't happening today or tomorrow, like nobody cares that much. Um, they'll plan for retirement, but nobody's really looking that far ahead, to be honest. Um, so that's the problem with that one. Most people would spend the extra cash generated by the expansion, so the fiscal policy would have the expansionary effect. So even with Ricardian equivalence, the rise in government spending would still lead to the boost in total spending in the near term. Even if they cut back their current spending, they would do so over an extended period. Um, so there's the thing. So here is the cautionary tale of this. For fiscal policy, unlike monetary policy, which we'll talk about in the next module, there are significant lags. Um, so It takes time to recognize that there's a gap, develop a plan. And here's the thing: fiscal policy is implemented by the legislative and executive branch. So they have to develop a plan. And if you're doing it in the legislative branch, just take a look at Congress nowadays. Just take a look at how these cats work. They have to come up with something and agree on that. Um, how long, how many legislative cycles do you think that's going to take? And then they have to have a plan to get that out. Um, so an implementation lag, what we call, he's got to spend money, but typically we call that implementation lag. And I'll talk about all three of these. So I'm just popping through to see if they're there. All right, so let's talk about this. All three of them. So, how long does it take to realize there is a problem? That is somewhere between 12 and 18 months. How long does it take them to actually get a plan together to pass a plan in the legislative branch? If we're lucky, that is 18 to 24 months. I mean, if it's a national problem, 18 months. Otherwise, it's 24, and it can be as high as 36 months. It could take as much as 3 years for that to happen. So actually, that should be 18 to 36 months. Um, and then implementation lag. How long does it take for that to get out? So let's assume for a moment there's already an agency in place that can implement this. God forbid that you have to create a new agency to implement this new plan, right? Because that is just going to take forever. But if there is somebody out there that can implement this, we can get it out in somewhere between, you know, 6 and 18 months. Now, the problem is letting people know that, hey, by the way, we've got this thing. And you people need to know that, hey, it's out there. The number of people over the years that I have met, and they're like, yeah, I've got this problem. I'm like, there's an there's a solution for that at this government office down the street. And they're like, really? Yeah, there is. It's really kind of crazy how that works. So, contractionary fiscal policy, uh, shifts the AD curve. No, causes inflation. Is effective. If effective, shifts the curve to the left, so D in that sense. Holding everything else constant, which of these statements is true? Um, not the first one, not the second one, just output's greater than actual aggregate output. C. All right, the multiplier. So there is the multiplier works. And we call it a private spending multiplier, but it also works for government spending. So you can just call it a spending multiplier. However, the government spending multiplier is much less than the private spending multiplier, and in the government spending side, it is estimated between 0 and 2. So in government spending projects, the multiplier is somewhere between 0 and 2. Um, it magnifies new spending into greater levels. An output because each round of spending becomes income for somebody else. So if we increase government purchases of goods and services, which is expansionary fiscal policy. It moves the aggregate demand curve to the right. We don't have to move it the whole way. We move it a part of the way, and then the multiplier kicks it over the rest of the way. Contractionary fiscal policy pushes it to the left. We move it a part of the way, and the multiplier kicks it the rest of the way. So, how much would a policy shift the aggregate demand curve? So, to figure that out, we use the multiplier. So the multiplier is just that ratio of change in real GDP caused by autonomous change in aggregate spending. If you remember from previous chapters, it's 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. No taxes, no trade, fixed interest rate, fixed prices. If MPC is 0.5, the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus 0.5, which is 2. So 50 billion in new government spending would create 50 billion times 2, or $100 billion in real GDP. That's us. So a multiplier on changes in government transfers and taxes. Government, so fiscal policy changes in government purchases, transfers, payments, maybe taxes. Uh, so change in government transfers or taxes shifts the aggregate demand curve by less than equal size change in government purchases. Um, so two expansionary fiscal policies. The government directly purchases $50 billion in goods and services. The government makes transfer payments, sending out 50 billion in checks to consumers. So what happens? And you basically have uh, if you basically 50 billion in goods and services, you're going to create $100 billion total. If you 50 billion rise in transfer payments, the first round is 25 billion, second round is 12.5, third round 6.25. You're only really ever going to get uh, $50 billion. So you get half that amount if you are uh, doing it, sending it to households. Because households spend some of the 50, but they don't spend it all. And so you have more leakages sending the money to households. Taxes change the size of the multiplier, but there's a tax multiplier, which is different. The tax multiplier is negative MPC over MPS. So because basically an increase in taxes causes a decrease in consumption, a decrease in taxes causes an increase in consumption. So it moves a different way. Uh, so lump sum taxes are taxes independent of income, don't change the multiplier, but they are rare. Most taxes are not lump sum, uh, but they reduce the size of the multiplier. So we assume that a dollar increase in real GDP raised disposable income by a dollar. Government taxes capture some of that increase, and disposable income increases by less than a dollar. Uh, the multiplier tells us who should get tax cuts or government transfers. An increase in unemployment benefits will boost the economy more than a dividend tax cut. So the effect of taxes on the multiplier is similar to the effect of international trade, which reduces the multiplier. So the multiplier process is weakened because at each stage some spending leaks um, instead of into imports, in this case into taxes. So most economists believe it's a good thing that taxes reduce the multiplier. If, for example, a negative demand shock causes a recession, incomes fall, taxes fall, the negative demand shock hurts the economy less than it would if there were no taxes. And the automatic decrease in government tax revenue acts like an automatic expansionary fiscal policy. So it helps. There are days it kind of like buffers everything. So automatic stabilizers. So, basically unemployment, taxes, all those things are like automatic stabilizers. Government spending and tax rules that cause fiscal policy to be automatically expansionary when the economy contracts and automatically contractionary when the economy expands are called automatic stabilizers. Discretionary fiscal policy is anything that Congress, who's the legislative branch, or the president, who's the executive branch, have to actually vote for or do intentionally, right? So these are deliberate actions by policymakers rather than rules. So the Obama stimulus or anything like that, um, those are things that you actually have to vote for or sign to put into place. These don't automatically happen. You have to go and do something for it to happen. Everything else constant, the multiplier effect for taxes or transfers is smaller than the multiplier effect for changes in autonomous uh, aggregate spending. All right, the budget balance. Let's save this one for the next video, and we'll start there for the what should be the last video.